Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the patient chart hit the floor tiles of Cedar Creek Medical's vegetative care unit. Katie Morrison bends without a word, fingers closing around the manila folder. Her movements are efficient, economical, the kind of precise that comes from a decade of practice in places where wasted motion meant wasted blood. The antiseptic smell burns her nostrils as she straightens, handing the chart back without eye contact. Around her, the morning rounds continue their choreography of beeping monitors and rolling gurneys, the controlled chaos of a Portland hospital that Katie has learned to navigate like she navigated every other institutional hierarchy, invisibly. She's been at Cedar Creek Medical for 2 years now. 2 years of 12-hour shifts, of gentle hands on the dying, of vital sign charts and bedpan emptying, and the particular loneliness of being a nurse nobody remembers by name. Her badge reads Kate Morrison, RN, Vegetative Care Unit. That's all they need to know. That's all anyone needs to know. Her scrubs are a standard hospital blue, fitting loosely enough to hide the scar tissue that maps her left shoulder like old geography. A tarnished challenge coin sits in her scrub pocket, pressing against her thigh through the fabric. She touches it unconsciously between patient rooms, a ritual so small nobody would notice. Metal warming against her palm. Muscle memory recognizing metal. Dr. Caldwell is chief of the vegetative care unit, and he moves through these hallways like a man who owns them. His voice carries the particular condescension of someone who has never been told no, never been corrected, never had to wonder if his authority was borrowed or earned. He is 52 years old, wears a Rolex that costs more than Katie's car, and speaks to the nursing staff as if they are well-meaning but fundamentally stupid. The residents follow him in a wake of deference and scrambling notepads. The attending physicians nod when he enters the room. Even the hospital administrators, when he calls, answer on the second ring. Katie has been invisible to all of them. This is not an accident. She moves through room for 47 now, where Major Vincent Hayes has been breathing through a ventilator for 2 years and 4 months. 2 years and 4 months since the IED detonated in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province. 2 years and 4 months since they pulled him out of the wreckage and loaded him onto a Black Hawk with a sucking chest wound and a pneumothorax that should have killed him in the first 30 seconds. The military paperwork that followed his arrival at Cedar Creek Medical is marked classified at 3 different levels. His family visits every other Sunday. His chart is thicker than a phone book. And his eyes have never opened since he arrived. Katie runs through his vitals with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times before. Heart rate, 68, sinus rhythm steady as a metronome. Oxygen saturation, 96% on the ventilator's current settings. Blood pressure, 128/82. The numbers are good. The numbers are always good. But the Major's brain remains silent behind his closed eyelids, and every specialist Cedar Creek Medical can offer has reached the same quiet conclusion: he is gone, and the body just hasn't realized it yet. She checks his central line with particular attention. The catheter runs from his right subclavian vein down into his superior vena cava, a thin plastic highway delivering nutrients his body can no longer extract from the world. The dressing around the entry point is clean, sterile, exactly as protocol demands. But the line itself needs repositioning. It has drifted a quarter inch from where it should sit, a millimeter migration that most nurses wouldn't catch, a shift that could be ignored for another week or 2 without incident. Katie notices it immediately. She's seen central lines in field tents with mortar fire shaking the walls, in helicopters where the rotor wash made steady hands shake, in forward surgical teams where the person next to you had taken fragmentation and the person behind you was already dead. She reaches for the line with her left hand, her scarred hand, and begins the repositioning with absolute precision. The technique is not taught in any nursing school. It comes from a theater of operations that most of the people in this hospital have only seen on news channels, if they've seen it at all. The gentle pressure, the angle of approach, the way the line slides back into optimal position as if magnetized toward the place it belongs, these are muscle memories written in muscle, not textbooks. That is when someone stops in the doorway. Captain James Mercer is wearing civvies, a blue polo shirt and khaki pants that almost hide the way he carries himself, like someone who has kicked down doors. He's here as a consultant, helping Cedar Creek with their trauma protocols, a combat medic on loan from the 160th SAW Night Stalkers for a 6-week rotation. He was walking past room 47 on his way to check on another patient when he saw Katie's hands working the line. He stops. His eyes narrow. The movement of recognition is so subtle that anyone who didn't know what to look for would miss it completely, a slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, a minute shift in his weight toward the doorframe. He watches her finish the repositioning. He watches her check the line placement twice, tracing the path of the catheter with her eyes the way only someone with formal training would do. He watches her secure the new dressing with the efficiency of someone who has done this in darkness, in sandstorms, in the kind of sustained adrenaline that makes every movement either necessary or suicidal. Katie finishes and turns. Her eyes meet his. There is a moment of absolute stillness in the room, broken only by the soft hiss of the ventilator and the distant beeping of monitors in adjacent rooms. The Major lies between them, unchanged, his breathing mechanical and perfect. "You've done this before," Mercer says. It is not a question. Katie is quiet for a long moment. Her jaw is steady. Her hands are steady. Her voice, when she speaks, is so soft you could almost miss it if you weren't listening for exactly this. 12 years. 3 tours. Different uniform. Mercer nods slowly. He steps into the room and closes the door behind him. Outside, the sounds of the ward continue their rhythm, monitors beeping, nurse call bells ringing, Caldwell's voice somewhere down the hallway making some intern explain their thinking. Inside, there is only the sound of the ventilator's steady mechanical breath and the sound of rain beginning to hammer against the window. Portland rain, the kind that comes without warning and falls like it has been waiting for months to arrive. "What happened?" Mercer asks. "That's classified," Katie says, and her voice carries the kind of weight that tells him she is not being evasive, she is being precise. "And you need to forget you saw that technique. You need to forget this conversation. You need to forget you recognized anything about the way I work." Mercer looks at her for a long moment. Then he looks at the Major, at the line that is now positioned correctly, at the careful dressing that will keep the catheter sterile and functional for weeks if not months. He looks back at Katie. "Who is he?" he asks, not asking who he is, asking who he was, asking what makes her stay in this room with this man who hasn't moved in 2 years and 4 months. Katie's hand moves to her pocket. The challenge coin is there, under the scrubs, warm metal against her fingers. She doesn't pull it out. "Someone who matters," she says. Someone who shouldn't have survived the operation that saved his life, but he did. Someone whose paperwork got classified so deep that the Pentagon erased half his file and ordered everyone who knew what happened to disappear. "And you disappeared," Mercer says. "I came here," Katie says. 2 years ago. I applied as a civilian nurse. They never ran a security check thorough enough to recognize me because I'm not supposed to exist anymore. And every day I come to work in Portland and I take care of a man who has been comatose for 2 years and 4 months, and I wait for him to wake up, and I hope that when he does, I'm still here." Mercer nods slowly. Then he reaches out his hand. His grip is firm, military, the kind of handshake that carries weight and recognition and the kind of understanding that only comes from having stood in the same sandstorm. "My name is Mercer," he says. "I saw nothing. I noticed nothing. I'm going on break now." He leaves. The door closes quietly behind him. Katie stands alone in room 47, her hand still pressed against her pocket, the challenge coin warm beneath her fingers. The Major breathes on, steady and unchanged, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical perfection of the ventilator. Outside, the rain hammers harder, and somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Caldwell's voice carries through the hallways, and Katie Morrison stands very still, holding the weight of 2 years and 4 months of silence, knowing that everything is about to change and having no way to stop it. But that wasn't the worst part. Caldwell's voice carries through the hallways, and Katie Morrison stands very still, holding the weight of 2 years and 4 months of silence, knowing that everything is about to change and having no way to stop it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came the next morning during attending rounds. Caldwell leaned against the nurse's station like he owned it, surrounded by 4 physicians in white coats, his voice pitched to carry across the entire unit. "Gentlemen, I'll give Morrison here 3 days before she cracks. A week, tops." He pulled out his wallet, slapping a $50 bill on the counter with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a bet in his life. "Any takers?" The doctors laughed. 2 of them added their own bills to the pile, bills that were probably tax-deductible somewhere in hospital accounting. Caldwell gathered the money slowly, deliberately, making sure Katie saw him do it. Making sure she understood the wager. Making sure she understood that her breaking point was entertainment. Katie continued entering vitals into the computer terminal 6 feet away, her fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision. Patient intake. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation. Heart rate. The mundane metrics of survival. She felt the weight of 5 pairs of eyes on her back, felt the shift in air pressure that comes with a predator identifying prey. Her jaw clenched once, barely perceptible, a muscle flexing for less than a second, then released. Her fingers never paused. The cursor blinked. The data filled in. Nothing changed. Caldwell watched her face for a reaction. Found none. His smile tightened at the edges. That was the calculation Katie had made 2 years and 4 months ago when she'd walked through Cedar Creek Medical's doors under a fabricated name, with fabricated credentials, carrying a tarnished military challenge coin in her pocket that proved she'd been someone else in another life. The military had erased her. Officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had never existed. Her service record was classified so deep that surfacing would compromise operations that had cost lives to protect. So she'd become this instead, quiet, forgettable, just a nurse in Portland who didn't make waves. But Caldwell had seen something in her stillness that he interpreted as weakness. And weakness, in his calculus, existed to be exploited. The next day, during cafeteria lunch, Katie sat alone at a corner table with a tray of soup, sandwich, and black coffee. The cafeteria smelled like industrial bleach mixed with something that had once been chicken. She'd finished 2 bites when Caldwell appeared, flanked by 2 residents like satellites orbiting a planet. He approached her table with the casual confidence of a man who believed the world bent around him. As Katie lifted her fork, Caldwell accidentally bumped the edge of the table. The word accidentally did a lot of work in that moment. The tray tilted. Soup cascaded across the linoleum in a spreading amber stain. The sandwich landed face down. The coffee cup shattered, sending ceramic shards skittering across the floor like accusatory fingers pointing at her. The cafeteria went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A fork clattered. Someone's chair scraped backward. In that silence, Caldwell's voice emerged smooth as oil on water. "Oh, sweetheart, you should be more careful. Maybe nursing isn't for everyone." His colleague snickered, the sound like hyenas confirming hierarchy. Katie stood. Soup darkened her scrubs in an expanding stain, the acrid smell of spilled broth mixing with something that smelled like betrayal. She walked to the tray return without cleaning up after herself, without looking at Caldwell, without the slightest tremor in her hands. Her hands were completely steady. They were the hands of someone who'd held bleeding soldiers in sandstorms, who'd applied pressure to exit wounds while Taliban bullets cracked overhead, who'd understood that the trembling wasn't fear, it was the body trying to survive. She dumped her empty tray and exited through the service door without acknowledging what had happened. The cafeteria erupted back into conversation the moment she left. In the staff bathroom, alone except for the fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby, Katie gripped the sink edge until her knuckles went white. She stared at her reflection for 30 seconds, really looked at herself, seeing the woman in the mirror instead of the persona she inhabited. The jaw was tighter. The eyes were different now. Older. 2 years and 4 months older than when she'd walked through Cedar Creek's doors trying to disappear. She released the sink and walked back to her shift without cleaning the soup from her scrubs. Let Caldwell see it. Let him think it meant something. The following morning, Caldwell reviewed her patient assessments during rounds, reading one aloud to the medical team in a mocking sing-song voice that would have sounded cartoonish if it wasn't so deliberately cruel. Patient shows no response to verbal stimuli. Really, Morrison? 2 years in a coma and you've determined he doesn't respond? What insight? He smiled at his own joke. The residents laughed right on cue, obedient as trained dogs. Call me Nightingale from now on, Caldwell announced to the room, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all low rumble and barely contained power. Since she has such a delicate touch with the hopeless cases. He began assigning her the most menial tasks, instructing residents to ask Nightingale for every degrading job on the unit. Emptying bedpans. Fetching ice chips from the machine down the hall. Restocking glove boxes. Cleaning equipment that the orderly should have been cleaning. Each time, Katie complied without a word. Her expression went blank as a mannequin, the kind of blank that comes from someone who knows how to disappear inside themselves. She moved through the hospital corridors with mechanical efficiency, performed each task with precision, and never once made eye contact with Caldwell or his satellites. But when she returned to Major Vincent Hayes's room, the comatose Special Forces officer she'd been assigned since arriving at Cedar Creek, something shifted. She approached his bedside with the focus of someone performing neurosurgery, not routine patient care. The major's central line ran into his subclavian vein, the placement critical to preventing infection. Katie's hands moved with practiced confidence, adjusting the dressing, checking the catheter position, repositioning the line with a technique that involved 3 separate hand positions and a level of anatomical understanding that most floor nurses didn't possess. That's when Captain Mercer appeared in the doorway. The combat medic had been visiting a different patient, walking through the unit, and had happened to glance into the major's room. His eyes narrowed as he watched Katie's hands move. That technique. That exact hand placement. The way she supported the line with her left hand while adjusting the dressing with her right. The angle of her approach to the vein. The small adjustment she made to prevent any stress on the catheter. He'd only seen that technique used by forward surgical teams in Helmand Province. He'd only seen it used by surgeons operating in field hospitals under enemy fire, where there was no room for error because error meant someone died on your hands. Captain Mercer's hand moved toward his phone before he stopped himself. He stood in the doorway for another 30 seconds, watching Katie work, his jaw clenching as he processed what he was seeing. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Katie didn't look up. Her hands never trembled. What happened next ended careers. The alarm came at 0300 hours. Not a gentle reminder. Not a warning. A scream. The kind of alarm that makes your nervous system fire on all cylinders, that makes your body remember things your mind has tried to forget. The heart monitor in Major Hayes's room was screaming. Not the steady, almost peaceful tone of asystole, the flat line of a heart that simply stopped. This was different. This was the erratic, chaotic pattern of cardiac tamponade. Electrical activity without mechanical response. A heart trying to beat inside a pressure vessel. Katie was at the nurse's station when the alarm sounded. She was in his room in 4 seconds, assessing while the night nurse fumbled with the code button. The major's jugular veins were distended, bulging like ropes under his skin. His blood pressure was crashing. 70. 60. 50. The numbers on the monitor scrolling downward like a countdown to something that couldn't be survived. A shifting shrapnel fragment. That was the diagnosis written in his chart, in the notes that Caldwell had never fully read. A fragment that had entered his chest during the ambush, that the surgeons in Germany had found but deemed too dangerous to remove, too close to his heart. That fragment had moved. It had shifted. It was now filling the pericardial sac with blood, compressing the organ, turning his chest into a hydraulic vice. The on-call physician was 20 minutes away. The crash cart arrived, but this wasn't a code cardiac arrest, this was a surgical emergency, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a defibrillator and a surgical blade. Katie's hands moved without conscious thought. She grabbed the ultrasound probe, confirmed the diagnosis in 2 sweeps across his chest. Fluid. Blood. Pressure. She reached for betadine, for needle selection, for the equipment that would let her perform a procedure that most trauma surgeons wouldn't attempt without imaging and a sterile OR. "What are you doing?" the night nurse gasped, her voice high and sharp. Katie didn't answer. Instead, she performed an emergency pericardiocentesis, inserting the needle below the xiphoid process at precisely the correct angle, the same angle she'd used in sandstorms with Taliban bullets cracking overhead, the same angle she'd used when every second meant the difference between survival and a body bag. The needle slid through skin and muscle and membrane with a subtle resistance that her fingers recognized as tissue giving way. The hiss of air escaping as blood flooded the syringe. 60 milliliters. 70. 80. She capped the syringe and the major's blood pressure stabilized immediately. 80. 90. 100. His heart found rhythm. His oxygen saturation climbed. His body remembered how to live. The night staff stood frozen. 3 nurses and a respiratory therapist, watching this quiet civilian nurse execute a procedure that belonged in a surgical theater, not a patient room at 0300 hours in a medical unit in Portland. They stood frozen because they'd just witnessed something that couldn't be explained by a normal nursing degree. Katie was capping the syringe when Dr. Caldwell burst through the door in wrinkled scrubs, having been called from home. He took in the scene in one glance, his patient alive, vital signs stable, Katie holding a syringe of blood that shouldn't have been drawn by anyone except a trauma surgeon in an operating room. His face went crimson. Not the red of anger. The red of a man watching his worldview reorganize itself in real time. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice was ice. Katie met his eyes for the first time since she'd retrieved his drop chart on day 1. The mask didn't slip. But something in her bearing had changed. Her posture had shifted. She was standing the way soldiers stand. She was standing the way people stand who've survived things that kill ordinary people. "I did," Katie said, her first full sentence to him. "He would have died. You're suspended. Effective immediately." Caldwell pulled out his phone, already dialing, his voice shaking with something that wasn't quite rage. It was fear. It was the fear of a man who'd just realized he'd been sparring with something far larger than himself. "Security to the ICU. Now." The heart monitor flatlined at 0300 hours. Not a slow decline. Not a warning. A sudden scream of flatline, the kind that stops time in a hospital corridor. Katie was charting in the nurse's station when the alarm cut through the pre-dawn silence, 3 surgical suites away, the major's ICU bed, room 412. She didn't run. Running was panic. She moved, her body already calculating distance, O2 accessibility, what would be waiting in that room. The attending physician was asleep in the call room. The resident on duty was in Trauma Bay 3 with a multi-vehicle collision, 15 minutes away minimum. The on-call cardiologist had texted he'd be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes was not an option. Katie pushed through the ICU doors and stopped cold. The major lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, but the monitor above his bed painted the truth in electric red. Not ventricular fibrillation. Not asystole. Something worse. The rhythm was chaotic, erratic, a heart trying to beat inside a cage that was crushing it. The blood pressure cuff cycled uselessly, 40/22. Then 38/20. Dropping. The night charge nurse stood frozen at the bedside, hand hovering over the code button. "We need the attending. We need." "Cardiac tamponade," Katie said. Not a question. She was already moving toward the emergency tray, her hand steady as stone. The major had been shot down in Helmand Province. Medevaced with shrapnel embedded in his chest wall. The surgeons at Kandahar had extracted what they could find, but shrapnel didn't always show up on imaging. Sometimes fragments worked themselves loose. Sometimes they shifted when a patient's intrathoracic pressure changed, when they moved the wrong way in their sleep, when gravity and time and the body's own healing mechanisms created new spaces where metal could migrate. Shifting shrapnel. It would have punctured the pericardium, the membrane around the heart. Blood would be pooling there, constricting, suffocating the organ's ability to contract. The heart was drowning in its own fluid. The charge nurse's voice was shaking. "We need to get the doctor. We need to call." Katie was already prepping. Alcohol wipe. Betadine. The skin at the xiphoid process, the bottom of the breastbone. She didn't wait for the resident. She didn't wait for the cardiologist. She didn't wait for permission from a system that had never seen what she'd seen, never worked a surgical site in Helmand Province with sand in her teeth and mortar rounds impacting 2 kilometers out, never held a soldier's heart in her hands while rounds pinged off the surgical tent's metal frame. Muscle memory was not memory at all. Muscle memory was the body's testimony to what it had survived. The needle was an 18-gauge angiocath, long enough to reach deep. Katie positioned it just below the rib cage, angled toward the left shoulder. The anatomy was the same whether you were in the cardiac cath lab at Cedar Creek or in a forward surgical team tent with generators humming and the smell of diesel and blood mixing with antiseptic. The body didn't care about your credentials. The body just needed someone who knew how to save it. She felt the resistance as the needle passed through layers, skin, subcutaneous tissue, the fibrous pericardium, and then the sudden yielding, the give that meant she was in the sack. Dark blood filled the syringe. Not the bright red of arterial flow. The dark red of pooled blood that had been suffocating the heart for hours, maybe longer. Katie pulled back steadily, drawing off the pressure, drawing off the compression, drawing off the thing that was killing him. 30 milliliters. 50, 80. The monitor began to change. Not instantly. Not dramatically. Just gradually, like a signal coming through static. The erratic rhythm smoothed. The chaotic peaks and valleys started to find structure, to find meaning. "BP's coming up," the charge nurse whispered. Her voice had changed. Had found something else in it. 85 over 50, Katie said, reading the cuff as it cycled. Holding. 88 over 52. The ventilator continued its metronome rhythm. The major's chest rose and fell. The monitor showed sinus rhythm now, steady and true, the rhythm of a man whose heart could finally beat the way it was meant to beat. Katie secured the angiocath with tape, the temporary measure, a bridge, and stepped back. The needle stayed in place. The blood had stopped filling the syringe. The pressure was equalized now, the suffocation released, the heart given room to work. The charge nurse was staring at her. How did you know? Get cardiothoracic involved, Katie said, not meeting her eyes. Just a nurse. Just someone checking vitals, reading monitors, knowing what the body was trying to tell her. He needs an echocardiogram within the hour. There's probably a fragment still in there. She was already pulling off her gloves. The room smelled like betadine and blood and the antiseptic tang of emergency. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical hum, indifferent to what had just happened. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, beep, 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 the sound of a man coming back from the edge. The attending physician arrived at 0315, sleep-rumpled and moving fast. He took one look at the monitor, at the major's stabilized vitals, at Katie standing motionless at the foot of the bed. Who performed the pericardiocentesis? His voice cut through the room like a blade. I did, Katie said. Cardiac tamponade from probable shifting shrapnel fragment. BP was dropping into shock. The cardiologist wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. The attending was already examining the needle placement, already checking the major's pupils, already reading the story that the body tells. His expression didn't change. You're not qualified to perform invasive procedures without physician approval. The major would have coded in the next 3 minutes. He would have been dead. You still don't have the authority. You don't have the credentials. You don't have. But the Major's heart was beating. The chest was rising and falling. The brain was receiving oxygen. Everything else was semantics. The attending turned away. Get this documented. Everything. Every step. And contact Dr. Caldwell immediately. He needs to know about this. Katie knew what that meant. She'd heard the edge in the attending's voice, not anger. Not gratitude. Fear. The fear of complications, of liability, of a nurse who had crossed a line that everyone agreed existed, even if that line had been drawn by people who'd never stood in an ICU at 0300 hours and watched someone die. She didn't speak. She documented everything with precision, the time of the flat line, 0302 hours. The patient's condition, critical, cardiac tamponade suspected. The procedure, emergency pericardiocentesis. The outcome, patient stabilized, vital signs improved. All of it in the clinical language that made blood and desperate measures sound like routine work. Because it was. It was routine for her. It was the work she'd been trained to do in places where medicine didn't wait for administrative approval. By 0800 hours, Dr. Caldwell knew. By 1000 hours, he'd placed a call to Stanley Whitmore, the board chairman who played golf with him every Saturday at the Waverley Country Club. An unauthorized invasive procedure, Caldwell said, his voice smooth as oil. Reckless endangerment, actually. She performed a pericardiocentesis without an attending physician present. Without the proper training. Without any credentials to justify. By noon, he'd contacted the nursing school in Sacramento where Katie's credentials supposedly came from, asking pointed questions about her training, her clinical hours, her references. The school confirmed she'd attended, but there was a hesitation in their responses, a careful phrasing that betrayed uncertainty. Caldwell was good at hearing what people weren't saying. By 1400 hours, Margaret Chen from the State Medical Board was walking through Cedar Creek's administrative corridor. She had the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years investigating healthcare violations. Caldwell had requested her specifically, a woman with a reputation for thoroughness and a track record of filing charges that actually stuck. Katie worked her shift knowing none of this was happening yet. She drew blood cultures. She monitored the Major's post-procedure status. She ensured the echocardiogram showed no fragments that required immediate reoperation. There was one, embedded in the right atrial wall, but the cardiologist decided it could be managed conservatively, could be monitored, could wait for a planned surgical intervention once the Major's baseline stability improved. She worked because working was what you did. By day 2, Margaret Chen had Katie's employment file spread across a desk in a back office. There were the reference letters, which did use language that seemed military in its precision and formality. There was the employment history, which showed a gap of exactly 2 years, from 2017 to 2019, with no explanation beyond private medical contracting. There was the emergency contact, a phone number with a 202 area code, Washington, D.C., which Chen had called at 0800 hours on a Tuesday and reached only a government voicemail system that confirmed the number was in service but provided no information about the person connected to it. 3 anomalies. 3 inconsistencies. Enough to open an investigation. Enough to make a case that something didn't add up. By day 3, Katie was called to the chief nursing officer's office on the 4th floor. The CNO, Patricia Huang, sat behind a desk that suddenly felt very large. Caldwell wasn't present, but his shadow was everywhere in that room, in the official tone, in the way Huang avoided eye contact, in the prepared statement she read from a sheet of paper she must have practiced multiple times. Pending the completion of the investigation into irregularities in your employment history and the unauthorized procedure performed on Major Hayes, you are suspended effective immediately. Your badge access is being revoked. You are barred from Cedar Creek Medical property pending the conclusion of the medical board's review. Katie didn't speak. She placed her badge on the desk, her stethoscope, her access card, each one a severing. Each one a piece of the identity she'd carefully constructed falling away. Security was waiting in the hallway. 2 men in blue uniforms, professional and impersonal. They escorted her through the corridors of Cedar Creek, past the nurse's station where she'd worked for 2 years, past the ICU where she'd just saved a man's life, past the morning sun coming through the skylights. She didn't look up. Not when she passed the cafeteria. Not when she walked through the lobby. Not when she felt Caldwell watching from his office window on the 2nd floor, his silhouette perfectly still, perfectly satisfied. The parking garage was empty at 1,500 hours on a weekday. Katie sat in her Honda Civic, space 247 on the 3rd level, engine dead, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. 2 hours passed. Maybe 3. Time had stopped meaning anything. The challenge coin was in her hand. Tarnished. Worn. Given to her in Helmand Province by the Major himself, back when he could walk, back when both of them had been something the world acknowledged. Back when there were witnesses. Back when classified operations meant something, meant that you'd served, meant that you'd sacrificed, meant that someone somewhere knew what you'd done. Now there was no proof. Now there was just a suspended nurse in a parking garage, a woman with no credentials that would hold up to scrutiny, a veteran whose service had been erased so thoroughly that she couldn't even defend herself without compromising operations that were still active, still sensitive, still classified beyond the reach of anything she could do. She couldn't call her commander. There was no commander. There was no unit. There was no one in the chain of command who could acknowledge her without destroying something else, something bigger, something that cost lives to protect. Her phone had 4 missed calls from a blocked number. She couldn't return them. The security guard didn't meet her eyes as he escorted Katie out through the main entrance. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. His radio crackled, code calls, trauma alerts, the hospital's heartbeat continuing without her. Cedar Creek Medical rose behind them, all glass and limestone, indifferent. She'd saved a man's life 3 weeks ago. Now she was being removed like a contamination risk. The guard's name tag read Patterson. He was young, maybe 26, and his jaw worked as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Protocol. Orders. Chain of command. Katie understood all 3 in languages most people never learned. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't slow her pace. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than physics should allow, a tarnished piece of metal stamped with the insignia of a unit that officially never existed, weighing more than lead, more than memory, more than the career that had just been erased in real time. Dr. Caldwell watched from his office window on the 3rd floor. Katie didn't look up to confirm it, but she felt his presence the way you feel a sniper scope on your chest, not by seeing it, but by some neural system that had kept her alive in places where making mistakes meant funerals. He'd made his calls in the 48 hours after the pericardiocentesis. 3 board members, each one returning his phone calls within an hour because that's what happened when you had institutional power, people answered. He described her unauthorized invasive procedures, her reckless disregard for chain of command, her fabricated surgical credentials that didn't check out. Margaret Chen, the CNO, had listened to him detail how Katie's background references were hollow, how her nursing credentials from civilian hospitals contained gaps, how her competence suggested training far beyond what her resume indicated. Caldwell had hired an outside investigator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves from a healthcare compliance firm in Seattle, who'd spent 2 days examining Katie's files, cross-referencing her references, finding exactly what Caldwell had paid her to find, inconsistencies that proved nothing except that some pasts couldn't be documented because documentation was classified. By that morning, Katie's badge access had been revoked. Her locker was packed into a cardboard box that Patterson now carried. Inside it, 2 extra sets of scrubs, a pair of sneakers, the challenge coin that she kept wedged beneath the false bottom. That coin had been given to her by Major Vincent Hayes himself, 8 years ago, in a forward operating base outside Helmand Province. It bore no name, no inscription, just the symbol of an operation that the Pentagon had buried so deep that even the people who'd lived through it weren't supposed to acknowledge it existed. She'd kept it in her pocket for 7 years as a nurse, touching it sometimes during night shifts when the weight of pretending to be ordinary got too heavy. Patterson walked her to the parking garage. The fluorescent lights cast everything in institutional green, making the concrete look diseased. Her car was a 2016 Subaru Outback, practical and forgettable, parked in the back corner where she'd always left it. She opened the driver's side door. Patterson set the cardboard box on the passenger seat, his hands moving with careful precision. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice the sound of someone about to commit insubordination, "that guy's been an asshole since before you got here." Katie didn't respond. Responding meant engagement, and engagement meant risk. She slid into the driver's seat. Patterson closed the door with the kind of gentleness that suggested he understood he was closing a coffin on something that shouldn't have died. The rain continued. Katie sat there with her hands at 10 and 2, the position she'd learned in a military vehicle 17 years ago, the position that was muscle memory now, the position that felt like the only thing left that was actually hers. The engine was off. The keys were in her hand. She could turn the ignition. She could drive somewhere. Home. A hotel. The airport. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. 2 hours passed like this. The parking garage hummed with the sound of people coming and going, shifts changing, visitors arriving, the rotation of human traffic that made no difference to her sitting here in the dark. Her phone sat on the console, that ancient burner phone with the blocked number that called her sometimes, that she never answered anymore because answering would mean the military was activating her for something classified and Katie Morrison had signed paperwork agreeing to stay dead. For missed calls had accumulated over the past 3 weeks. She hadn't checked the voicemail. Checking it would be accepting that there was somewhere she was supposed to be, someone she was supposed to be, and right now there was nothing but parking garage air and the weight of a coin in a cardboard box. She finally reached for the coin. Pulled it out. The metal was tarnished to the color of old smoke, worn smooth on one side from 8 years of fingers that belonged to a man who shouldn't have survived an ambush that official military reports called a personnel loss event. Major Vincent Hayes had been unconscious for 2 years. Katie had performed a pericardiocentesis in the dark at 0300 hours, drawing blood from around his heart while a cardiac tamponade was literally squeezing him to death, her hands moving on their own through a procedure she'd done 16 times in combat conditions where anesthesia was a luxury and pain was information and staying alive was the only metric that mattered. She'd done it because he was her patient and the alternative was watching him die in front of her, and Katie Morrison didn't let people die. Not in Helmand Province. Not in Portland. Not anywhere. And for that, she'd been suspended, investigated, and escorted from the building by a young security guard who pitted her. The challenge coin caught the amber light from the parking garage lamp. It showed Major Hayes' unit insignia on one side, Delta Squadron, JSOC Task Force designation, name redacted, everything classified. The other side bore an inscription in letters so worn they were nearly invisible, so that others may live. It had been the unit motto. Katie had lived that motto. She'd stayed alive so others could. She'd kept Major Hayes breathing so someone else would survive. That was the trade. That was the mission. That was what separated soldiers from civilians, the willingness to trade yourself for them. But the trade wasn't supposed to follow you home. The trade wasn't supposed to cost you your career when you were nursing in a civilian hospital. The trade wasn't supposed to get you fired by a man in a tie who'd never heard gunfire and never would. Katie pressed the coin against her palm. The metal was cool. It was the only thing in the world right now that was real, this tarnished piece of history, this proof that she'd been something other than a failed nurse. It was the only evidence left that Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had ever existed. Everything else had been classified, redacted, buried, and officially denied. She didn't cry. Crying would have been a luxury she'd trained out of herself a long time ago. Instead, she sat there in the parking garage of a hospital that had thrown her away, holding a coin that was worth nothing in a civilian court, and thought about the last 2 hours of her career at Cedar Creek Medical, the termination hearing that would happen in 3 weeks, the formality of being officially fired, the slow official death of a reputation that had been fiction anyway. The rain hammered the roof of her Subaru. Somewhere in the hospital above the garage, Major Vincent Hayes was still unconscious. Somewhere in his brain, the damage from the ambush was still rewiring itself, neural pathways struggling to reconnect after months in darkness. Katie had kept him alive long enough to have a chance at that recovery. Dr. Caldwell had made sure everyone knew that had been unauthorized. She turned the key. The Subaru didn't start. She turned it again. Nothing. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the kind of fine tremor that came from holding yourself together so hard for so long that your body forgot how to be relaxed. She released the steering wheel. Gripped it again. Held the coin so tight it would have left a mark if anyone had been around to see it. The parking garage was empty except for the rain and the darkness and a woman who'd saved lives in languages the hospital would never speak. 3 weeks later, Katie sat in a conference room at Cedar Creek Medical, her hands folded on the laminate table in front of her. The termination hearing had been scheduled for 2:44 p.m. It was 1:38 p.m. Margaret Chen, the hospital's chief counsel, shuffled papers across from her while Dr. Caldwell sat 3 chairs down, his expression a mixture of triumph and thinly veiled contempt. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting everything in a sickly institutional white. Katie had worn her civilian clothes, dark jeans, a grey sweater, nothing that suggested who she'd been or what her hands had learned to do in places that no longer officially existed on any map. The challenge coin sat in her pocket, worn smooth from 7 years of her fingers finding it in moments like this. Its weight was the only thing keeping her grounded. The hospital administrator was reviewing her file when the intercom crackled. Code Blue, Emergency Department. Incoming stroke patient, ETA for minutes. Margaret glanced up. We should continue, but the sound of rushing footsteps in the hallway interrupted her. Emergency calls weren't unusual at Cedar Creek, but something about the urgency of this one felt different. Katie felt her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign that she'd noticed. For minutes later, the conference room door burst open. A nurse stood in the doorway, pale, breathing hard. Ms. Chen, we need someone from administration in the ER. The incoming patient, we need to identify him. We're in the middle of a hearing, Caldwell snapped, already reaching for his briefcase. Handle it. But Katie had already stood. She moved toward the door without asking permission, her body recognizing something her mind hadn't yet processed. The nurse blinked, clearly expecting an argument, then stepped aside. The emergency department was controlled chaos, 3 nurses, 2 residents, an attending physician moving with practiced efficiency around a gurney. The patient was a man in his 50s, dark-skinned, one side of his face already slack with the beginning of stroke paralysis. His left arm was useless. His mouth couldn't form words, just sounds, moans of frustration and fear. Katie's breath caught. She knew this face. Not from Cedar Creek. From Lashkar. From a firefight outside the gates of a forward operating base 7 years ago, when this man had been bleeding from a shrapnel wound and she'd been the only surgeon available within 50 kilometers. He'd been Taliban then. Now he wore a fleece vest and spoke accented English when he could speak at all. He'd defected. Turned intelligence asset. The military had relocated him stateside, given him a civilian life, made him disappear into Portland like they'd made Katie disappear. His eyes moved. Found her in the crowd of medical personnel. His pupils dilated. His body went rigid. Lioness, he whispered. Just that one word, fractured by the stroke, but unmistakable. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made the attending physician pause. Lioness. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hiss. Katie didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. James Dockery, the security guard posted at the ER entrance, was a retired Army corporal who'd served 2 tours before a knee injury ended his career. He'd worked at Cedar Creek for 4 years, pushing patients in wheelchairs, breaking up drunk visitors, maintaining order. He wasn't supposed to recognize things. He wasn't supposed to understand classified operations or understand the difference between a nurse and something far more lethal. But he heard that word, lioness, and something in his training activated. His posture changed. His shoulders rolled back. His eyes snapped to attention, and when he looked at Katie, his entire demeanor shifted from civilian security to military precision. He stood at full attention, despite the 30 years since he'd worn a uniform. "Master Chief," he said quietly. Not a question. A recognition. A salute without moving his hands. Katie's composure didn't crack, but something shifted in her chest. Someone remembered. Someone knew. The attending physician was already calling for a CT scan, already requesting neurology consult, the clinical work continuing around the emotional detonation happening in the ER. The combat interpreter, his name was Farik, Katie remembered now, though she'd only ever called him by his call sign, Ghost, was already being moved toward radiology. His eyes never left hers as the orderlies wheeled him away. "Lioness stays," he tried to say, but the stroke had stolen his words. Just fragments. Just the ghost of a plea. Katie turned and walked back toward the conference room. James Dockery watched her go, standing at attention the entire way, a silent witness to the presence of a ghost. The hearing room felt smaller when she entered. Caldwell was checking his watch. Margaret Chen was reviewing her notes. The hospital administrator was explaining something about protocol and professional standards. Katie stood in the doorway. "There's an incoming patient," she said quietly. "I need to request a recess." "Absolutely not," Caldwell said, not bothering to look up. "We're almost." The elevator doors down the hallway chimed. Boots on tile. Multiple sets. Crisp military cadence, the kind of walk that made civilians unconsciously straighten their spines. For military police officers in dress uniforms emerged from the stairwell, then two more, then a figure in a navy dress blue uniform with shoulder boards that caught the fluorescent light. Admiral Marcus Tate, Director of Naval Special Operations Command, walked into Cedar Creek Medical like he'd already claimed it through sheer force of will. Behind him came an officer carrying a leather folder. Behind her came an FBI agent with a badge clipped to her belt. Caldwell's face went pale. The Admiral didn't knock on the conference room door. He opened it. The room's air pressure seemed to change. "Admiral Marcus Tate," he announced, not to any of them in particular, but to the room itself, the way a judge might announce a verdict. "I'm here on behalf of the Department of Defense regarding the disposition of classified personnel operating under civilian cover at this facility." Margaret Chen stood immediately. "Admiral, we're in the middle of..." "You were," Tate interrupted, his voice measured and absolute. "You're not anymore." He nodded to the officer, who opened the folder. Inside lay 6 pages of paper, all of them stamped with classification headers that made the room go silent. "Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison," Tate said, reading from the documents, "served the United States Navy for 15 years, 7 months, and 12 days. Her service record includes operations in 3 theaters spanning 12 years of continuous deployment. She has been awarded the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross for valor under fire. Each medal hung in the air like a separate reality. She performed surgical interventions in forward operating environments without access to standard equipment or anesthesia," Tate continued, his tone never wavering. "Her actions directly resulted in the survival of 4,847 service members who would otherwise have died on surgical tables that didn't exist under protocols that are still classified." He turned a page. "She was decorated for operations that officially never happened in locations that no longer exist under names that she is legally forbidden to speak." Caldwell started to stand. "This is irrelevant to the hospital's investigation." "Sit down," Tate said, and Caldwell Saturday. The Admiral's voice had that particular timbre that came from command authority at levels most people would never encounter. Following Operation Copper June, Master Chief Morrison's records were classified and sealed. She was ordered to disappear, to take a civilian identity, because the operation's details could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and endanger assets still in theater. She obeyed that order, even though it meant erasing 15 years of service from her official record. She accepted a subordinate position at a civilian hospital. She accepted public humiliation. She accepted erasure. Tate set down the first folder and looked directly at Caldwell. And during her termination investigation, someone attempted to alter her federal personnel file. The room went absolutely still. One of the FBI agents stepped forward with a laptop. The screen glowed with email logs, timestamps, phone records, a trail of digital evidence laid out in chronological precision. Caldwell's face had gone from pale to the color of raw meat. A vein was beginning to pulse at his right temple. 3 days ago, Dr. Philip Caldwell contacted a record administrator at the Department of Defense, Tate said, reading from the screen, claiming to be conducting a federal security clearance review on Katie Morrison. When the administrator denied his request, Dr. Caldwell submitted falsified documents suggesting that Master Chief Morrison had been dishonorably discharged for misconduct and that her civilian references were fabricated. He attempted to introduce these falsified federal documents into her termination record. "That's impossible," Caldwell said, but his voice had cracked. "I never?" "The phone records show 3 calls from your office to the Pentagon," the FBI agent said quietly. "The emails are on your hospital server. And the falsified DD Form 214 has your name on the submission sheet." She held up a folder. "Falsifying federal records is a felony, Dr. Caldwell. Federal crime. 10 years, minimum, depending on the prosecutor's mood." Caldwell stood so fast his chair went backward, skidding across the tile with a sound like a bone breaking. "This is a witch hunt. I was protecting this hospital from." "From what?" Margaret Chen's voice was ice. "A decorated war hero who saved lives while you were playing politics." She stood, her entire demeanor shifting from neutral counsel to someone who'd just realized she'd been defending the wrong person. "From someone more competent than you? From someone who made you feel small." 2 FBI agents entered the conference room. They moved with the kind of calm authority that made everyone else in the room unconsciously step back. One of them approached Caldwell, badge out, reading him his rights in a voice that was professional and utterly final. The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists with a metallic sound that seemed to echo through the entire hospital. Katie watched, completely expressionless, as they began walking him out of the conference room. But they didn't take him toward the parking garage. They took him down the main hallway of Cedar Creek Medical, past the nurse's station where he'd thrown the chart, past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her tray to the floor, past the ICU where she'd saved his patient while he'd been making phone calls to board members and plotting her destruction. Doctors and nurses began to emerge from rooms, from charts, from supply closets. They lined the hallway as Caldwell was walked toward the exit. Someone started clapping, slowly at first, a single resident with tears streaming down her face, then another nurse, then an entire floor of medical professionals who'd all watched this man wield his authority like a weapon for years. The applause followed him all the way out of the building, building in volume and intensity, not the sound of justice but the sound of something heavier, the sound of a system recognizing one of its own predators and finally casting it out. Caldwell's face was purple. The veins at his temples bulged like they might split his skull. His jaw clenched so hard the fluorescent light seemed to reflect off the tension in his muscles. He was escorted past the exit while security and Federal Bureau of Investigation agents followed, making sure he left the building. The investigation that followed would take weeks, but the results were immediate. 2 other instances of Caldwell fabricating performance reviews to remove staff members he perceived as threats, financial irregularities in research grant applications, a pattern of abuse that had been protected by his institutional power until the moment that power collided with something far larger than any hospital could contain. 18 months later, Katie Morrison wore a new badge at Cedar Creek Medical. The title read Director of Emergency Medicine. She wore it with the same quiet competence she'd worn scrubs as a nurse, the kind of authority that came from surviving things that most people would never have to survive. She'd taken to walking past the strip mall in northeast Portland sometimes, just to see. Through the window of a discount financial services storefront, she'd seen Philip Caldwell sitting at a folding table with a banner that read, Supplemental Insurance, Ask Me How. He'd gained weight. His tie was cheap polyester. His phone sat in front of him, and he picked at it between customers who almost never came. He didn't look up when she walked past. He never looked up anymore. Inside Cedar Creek, in a room on the 4th floor, Vincent Hayes, Major Vincent Hayes, Special Forces, the patient who'd lain unresponsive for 2 years, was sitting up in physical therapy. His legs were weak, still relearning how to hold weight, but his eyes were clear. His mind was sharp. Katie had overseen his recovery personally, bringing to his rehabilitation the same precision she'd used in Helmand Province, the same attention to detail that had kept him breathing when everything else had tried to kill him. She entered his room in the afternoon, when the sunlight came through the window in sharp geometric angles. He was working with resistance bands, his biceps still thin but gaining definition, his determination absolute. "Master Chief," he said, and the title carried weight now, public knowledge, a source of pride throughout the hospital instead of a source of shame. "Just Katie," she said, but she was smiling. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the tarnished military challenge coin. The one he'd given her 7 years ago, the night before the ambush, a tradition among his unit. The coin was worn smooth on one side from years of her fingers finding it in parking garages and conference rooms and moments when she'd needed to remember why she was still alive when so many others weren't. His eyes widened. He recognized it immediately. She placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. "You gave it to me when I needed to remember why I was there," she said quietly. "I'm giving it back now that you need to remember why you're here." He looked at the coin, then back at her. Outside the window, Portland's skyline stretched under grey sky, rain beginning to streak the glass. The city moved on below them, ordinary and persistent, full of people who had no idea about surgical teams or classified operations or the price of keeping those kinds of secrets. "They told me you don't exist," he said. "Officially." "I exist enough," Katie replied. In the hallway, James Dockery stood at his post, maintaining his quiet attention whenever she passed. In the lobby, a young Marine checked in, service dog at his side, prosthetic leg, eyes carrying the particular weight of someone still learning how to exist in a world that had tried to discard him. Katie approached him, introduced herself, her voice calm and certain. The Marine saw her name badge, saw something in her eyes that suggested she understood things he couldn't yet articulate, and he straightened. "Power is not a title," Katie said to him, guiding him toward registration. "Power is the ability to help. If you made it this far, you've just experienced what happens when institutions fail the people who've sacrificed everything, and what happens when someone finally demands accountability. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Katie's position? And if you know a veteran who's disappeared into the civilian world, carrying secrets they can't speak, take a moment to recognize them. True heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they push wheelchairs through hospitals. Sometimes they save lives in the dark.